Mr. Speaker.
Call Kelvin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, I have very few problems with what the intent of this legislation is. That is to collect information so that these deportees, when they return back to New Zealand, can be monitored by probation, by the parole services, by whoever needs to monitor them. That isn't really the point. We have objections around the time it's taken to get this bill to the House, the shoddy drafting of the legislation. I mean, let me give you an example. On the 25th of January, in the Northern Advocate, which is not exactly the world's most widely read newspaper, there was a report about a woman who was deported from Australia, who participated in a murder in Australia and was sentenced for a number of years and was deported back to Kaikohe. I won't name the woman because I don't want her to, she's got to get on with her life. But she's not going to be much of a problem to the Kaikohe community. Murderers don't tend to go on and murder over and over again, except of course serial murderers, I must admit. But that woman is very little risk to the Kaikohe community. But the point of the story is that in that newspaper report on the 25th of January, there is the former Justice Minister, Judith Collins, saying that this was an issue, that is the deportation of prisoners, this is an issue the government was aware of and which needed to be changed. She then goes on to say the government is looking into a monitoring scheme for serious offenders deported to New Zealand. That's in January. We have an admission by the former Justice Minister, the predecessor of our current Justice Minister, saying they're well aware of this issue and that they are looking into a monitoring system for serious offenders deported to New Zealand. And now, 11 months later, we're going through this whole process based on legislation that's taken 12 days to draft. There is something seriously wrong with the story that we're being told, the country's been told, in terms of the genesis of this legislation. The Minister who's just finished speaking talks about the primary goal is public safety. We have no problems with that. But my question is, how does deporting people from Australia, dumping them here in New Zealand with a couple of $100 in their back pocket, with vouchers for 5 days in a motel, and then telling them that they are on their own, how is that going to protect public safety? When they don't have the support systems around them, they don't have their family networks around them because they're back in Australia. They don't have legal representation here in New Zealand because their lawyers back in Australia. How is that going to help keep New Zealand or make New Zealand a safer place, by them not having their support systems, by them not having the proper networks and social services wrapping around them to the extent they should? The Prime Minister stands up and says he's the only person that's speaking for victims in New Zealand. Well, that's rubbish, because if these guys are not supported to the extent they should be, what the Prime Minister is going to do with this regime is create more victims here in New Zealand, and that is what we are trying to prevent at all costs. That is why we say that this legislation, while it's good to look at the information gathering side of things and all that, it's missing in the fact that there's no mention or little mention of the support services that need to be wrapped around these guys, because once their 5-day motel vouchers run out, where do they stay then? What's going to be put in place for them? That's why I suggested some 5 or 6 weeks ago, why doesn't the government fund a marae? And let's face it, many of these people are Māori. They're coming back. Why doesn't the government fund a marae to look after these people, to cater for them, to accommodate them for 4 or 5 weeks while services can come in and provide some comprehensive wraparound, get them on their feet, help them to get a job, help them to get an IRD number, all those sorts of things that they probably don't have. Because as I've said just in the committee stages, many of these people, they have no connection to New Zealand. One person I met on Christmas Island, a young man by the name of Ronald Nielsen, was born in Australia. He has no connection to New Zealand. He said to me, if they're going to deport me to Bali. He knows more about Bali than he does New Zealand. Despite the fact that his parents were born here, he has no connection. Then the minister, she said, made out like she's the only person running around doing things that they've set up this information sharing about the criminal risk, and well, that's great, all this information sharing, that's fine, but the information that the Australian government hasn't shared to us is the number of people who are on the plane that are meant to be arriving tomorrow, where that plane's going to land, what the names of those people are, the most basic things. They haven't shared that information with. So it's fine to get on a high horse and start talking about the great system they've set up sharing information, but when it comes to what's happening on the ground and what's going to happen tomorrow with the arrival of a plane load of deportees, they haven't shared the most basic bits of information. And so how do we support these people? We don't know who they are. We don't know their criminal record. We don't know where they're going to go. I wonder if those people know which motel that they're going to be put up in. None of these questions are answered. That means these people are bound to be dumped on our streets, and if they do not have the support systems that they require, and they run out of food, and they run out of clothes, and they're cold at night, and they have no money, chances are they're going to have to resort to crime to get by. They are being set up to fail. All the monitoring in the world by probation doesn't put food in someone's stomach, doesn't get them money, doesn't give them a job. And these are the issues, Mr. Speaker, that we have concerns about. Some of these people have not even committed crimes in Australia. They've been deported because they fail a character test. And let me tell you about something that I believe is extremely frightening, and that is an operation by the Australian authorities, their border force, that's the immigration people, and their police. It's Operation Fortitude. Just Google it. It's an operation that was meant to go ahead in October of this year, where the Australian police and the Australian border force were going to randomly check people's visas on the streets of Melbourne. And if there were issues, so basically they're racially profiling or profiling people, checking their visas, and if their visas are not up to scratch, then they can be detained and deported. And those people could well end up here in New Zealand for doing nothing more than just not having their visas up to scratch or completing that process properly, Mr. Speaker. That means we can have more people uplifted from their homes in Australia, from their families, their support networks, and landed here on New Zealand soil, where we actually have to look after them, where we have to re-establish them. And of course, as I've said, if we don't do that properly, these people will be set up to fail. And they haven't committed a crime, they'll be set up to fail. Does that mean that they have to commit crime to get by? Does that mean we create more victims in New Zealand? Mr. Speaker, I just want to finish telling the story, and I've told it already during the course of this debate, about a young guy, Bo Adams, whose entry into the Australian criminal system was on dubious grounds to start with. He had a domestic violence order put against him. The person who put that domestic violence order against him then texted him, phoned him, insisted that he drive her somewhere. They argued. She claimed that he broke the domestic violence order. He was then in prison, and I don't even know that he went to court. He was definitely on remand. He was there for 159 days, I think, 159 days before he was eventually sent to Perth from the east coast where he lived, sent to Perth and then on to Christmas Island. I'm not even sure that that guy has been charged with a crime and has been sent back, could possibly, be sent back to New Zealand, where he hasn't been since he was 4 years old. This is the sort of... I know that Australia have the sovereign right to make the laws that they make, but their laws are wrong, and we in New Zealand are the ones that are bearing the brunt of their poor laws. And if this doesn't work, if this law that we're enacting now doesn't work, then we are going to create more New Zealand victims. Kia ora.
Jackie Dean.